One of the most common questions everybody asks when they start playing Throne and Liberty is what class do I play? Or what two weapons do I choose? Now, right at the beginning, when you're just getting through the tutorial and it gives you a bunch of common gear, don't worry too much about it. Changing after that point is actually pretty easy. It's not until you get to the point in your Path of Ascension where it's giving you your tier 2 gear that it really matters, because after that, changing weapons can be relatively expensive. A lot of people still end up changing weapons anyway as they chase what's new and great and all that. So it's still possible. Just know that that's the point in where you really want to know which class you want to play. So with that, I have assembled a tier list of what classes you should look to play when you get to that point in your Path of Ascension and picking out your gear from the selection box. Okay, so let's go over it here. Okay, so with this tier list, you have to understand a few things. First, it's not an end-all, be-all necessarily. I focus primarily on when you're choosing your weapons from the Path of Ascension. Later, when you get Archboss or Guild weapons, that could change your class just because the power of those weapons can really change how things work. Second, I very much took this as you're a new player kind of approach, which is why these are down here at the bottom, and we're going to talk about this. When you first start the game and you're playing through the campaign, you want to be able to do damage. You're playing the damage, the tank, and the healer. And if you don't do a whole lot of damage, it will not only make that harder, but just long and tedious. And so that is a big reason why these are down here. The other reason is when you get into dungeons with other players. If you're still learning the dungeon and don't know what it is that you're supposed to be doing yet, it can be very difficult. The tank and the healer are very linchpin roles. If you don't know what you're doing, it's highly likely that the team will fail. And unfortunately, it is highly likely that if the team notices that you're the tank or the healer and you don't know what you're doing, they'll kick you from the party and you won't be able to complete the dungeon. On the flip side, if you're one of these classes, mainly taking the sword and shield or the longbow and wand, and you try to queue as a DPS so you can learn the mechanics and learn the dungeon, it's highly likely that you'll get kicked out as well. It's one of the unfortunate truths with all games, and it's just kind of how it is in Throne and Liberty and how it works. So for that reason, I highly suggest you do not start as a tank build, which is your SNS, or the Seeker, which is your main healer class, which is wand and bow. Later, you can build into them and have either the sword and shield become your third weapon, or the opposite of whichever one you don't take for your wand and bow. So if you want to be a healer, you can very much have your DPS class be a wand or a longbow. Just don't take both to start. And if you want to be a tank, this is in order in terms of the most desired to the least desired. Sword and shield and greatsword, sword and shield and spear, wand, orb, dagger, bow, staff, crossbow. So if you want to be a tank, start at this end and look at the second weapon and try to include that weapon in your build or in your DPS class. Outside of that, though, if you're not worried about becoming a healer one day or a tank, you don't have to worry about this part. Just don't start there. I highly recommend you don't. All right, so tier list at the very top here. The first one is the wand and orb. Interestingly, this is actually also a healer class. It can do decent heals, but it can also do a lot of damage. Now, the wand itself actually won't do a lot of damage until you get to about 100 weapon mastery, which is a big reason why the Seeker really suffers with damage, especially in the early game. But your orb will make up for that. So you have flexibility of queuing as DPS or healer if you want to play that as well. Greatsword Spear, which is for your tank side, is great at AoE damage. So this can be a very good class. The unfortunate side is you don't have any range, which can be inconvenient at times. Not necessarily hard, just inconvenient. The wand and staff, at the time of this recording, is the most sought after class. Again, your wand can become your healer, and the staff does a lot of damage, and so it's a good combination. Spear Dagger is also very good at AoE, just like the Greatsword Spear. Your spear can be used for your tank later, and it's in the conversations in the best AoE, as is the Greatsword Spear. Greatsword Dagger, kind of a combo of those two. Not quite as good as AoE, but you have more survivability. So if you struggle staying alive against a lot of enemies, but still want to do decent AoE damage, that's probably the class you want to go with. Now, depending on when you're watching this, you may have heard or not have heard the Crossbow Orb or Crucifix class. When the Orb was a new weapon that just came out, it synergized so well with the crossbow that it became the de facto DPS class. If you were a Crossbow Orb player, you would do more damage than the other 5 people in your team combined. It was very overpowered. But it's been recently pulled back. Now it's in line with everything else. We're getting our the most recent patch with it tonight, actually. But this is still a very powerful DPS class. The Orb can become a healer later if you care, but it's still a very good DPS class, just it's no longer super powered, so there are a lot of complaints that it doesn't work anymore, which isn't true. It still very much works. It's just not the overpowered class. All right, so the second set of choices, if you don't want to go with these, the Staff Orb. Unlike the Crossbow Orb, this was powerful and doesn't really change a whole lot with the things they've updated with the Orb, so it's a very powerful DPS class. Next is the Greatsword Staff. Now, this is kind of an off build. A lot of the top meta doesn't play this class, but as a solo player or just someone more casual, the Greatsword gives you good survivability, decent AoE and damage, a lot of stuns, while the staff does good damage. So this is actually a very good class to play if you're not worried about doing necessarily top tier content. It's also actually not bad in PvP if you're interested in playing PvP. Staff Spear, kind of along those same lines, good at AoE and single target damage. It doesn't have any self-sustain though, so it kind of has a drawback there. Is another off-build meta class, but if you're not worried about the top tier content yet, or necessarily anything like you don't care about what other people are playing, this is actually surprisingly powerful and has some good synergy. Bow Crossbow, a little bit of a support class because you have your longbow, and it works pretty well together. It is a little better in PvP, but it actually still works relatively well, specifically at single target in PvE. Next is your bow staff. Actually, this is a good support class, support DPS. The longbow gives a lot of damage to your team, while you get good damage out of the staff. Finally, if you don't care again about being a healer, Crossbow Dagger is actually a pretty decent class. Your AoE will suffer, but your single target's pretty good, and when you get the right set of daggers, you can very much compete at the top end for damage output on a single target. Okay, after that, this first class, Wand Crossbow, this class actually can be very powerful. There's a bug right now, though. It doesn't work particularly well against world bosses because of a bug. Hopefully they fix that. And then also, in order to do a lot of single target damage, it kind of very much requires the right gear. And so from your Path of Ascension, I don't know if I necessarily start here. You can, but it's not necessarily the most ideal. But it is a very powerful class down the road. Staff Crossbow, again, another off build, good single target damage, kind of like Greatsword Staff or Staff Spear. You could play this one if you don't really care about becoming a healer or a tank down the road. Greatsword Wand is a good DPS support class. You could be a tank or a healer with this class. It's not going to do the most amount of damage, but it'll be all right. And there is definitely high-end parties, there we go, that use this class and the Greatsword Bow next to really buff up the damage. You don't want your whole party full of these by any means, but you definitely want at least one Greatsword and one Longbow in the party and one Wand in the party. So these actually work pretty well in the high-end content as a one-off DPS. Wand Dagger can be very good at single target. It suffers with multi-target with AoE, but with the right gear, you can actually do really, really well later as well. Not as good as crossbow dagger, but it's not too terribly bad. Finally, wand spear. This one I debated as to where to place it, B or C. There's not a lot of good synergy here, although the wand does give your spear the survivability that the spear doesn't come with. Spear has a lot of health, but there's no health regen, and so as you take damage, it's hard to regenerate it with the spear, where the wand will fix that for you. However, instead of putting it down here because there's not a lot of synergy, I put it here because your wand can be your healer, or your spear can be your sword and shield later if you're interested in becoming a tank or a healer, which most players are. Most players have a DPS class as their main, and then a tank or a healer as a secondary. Okay, last here. These first two, the staff and dagger, bow and dagger, decent in PvP actually, but in PvE there's not a lot of good synergy, and you'll kind of struggle. You do have range and melee, which is kind of nice, but yeah, these just in PvE compared to everything else, it just doesn't kind of work. I mean, technically everything works. It just compared to everything else, these are on the weaker end. Bow spear, same thing, but even less so than these because this doesn't really work in PvP either. Spear crossbow is a really weird one. Greatsword crossbow is a really weird one. Not very many people play these. They just don't synergize very well. Again, you can play it if you want to, but it's very off kilter. All right, last I added in Unexplored. I had these at C, but realistically, they're not necessarily C because nobody knows yet. These are more unexplored because the crossbow orb just dominated the orb conversation. Not enough people have explored these yet, so we don't really know how they're going to turn out, but there's some thoughts and ideas. Greatsword orb is a good support class, support DPS class. And again, you can become your tank or healer later, so it could work out. Spear orb, kind of the same thing. More AoE, less survivability, but you'll probably do okay with both of these. The orb dagger, hard to see synergy there, so it probably won't work, but it might, just given that you have a decent amount of survivability and a lot of fast attacks, which could be very interesting. But of the ones here, this one's probably your least versatile. Finally, bow orb. This is kind of a big question mark. This is technically a healer class with a longbow and orb, but can work for damage potentially. So you're not likely to get kicked like you would with a seeker, and you can be a healer with this, but it's still unknown. And this healer class, thus far at least, has not proven to be as good as the wand orb, and definitely not as the seeker. Wand bow, sorry. At least in PvE. In PvP, these wand orb and wand bow are a little closer. This one's lagging a little bit, but it could end up being useful as people figure it out more. So these are kind of more unexplored. Who knows? If you want to try them, you're welcome to. So that's the tier list of what class you should pick, and depending on how you want to play and what you want to lean towards later. And again, what gear you have definitely changes. There will be people that say crossbow dagger just doesn't work, which isn't true, but it definitely works a lot better if you have the right daggers. Wand staff is a favorite. Wand crossbow is also a favorite, but kind of requires the right gear. So out of your Path of Ascension, that's what this focuses on. This is the tier list of classes that you want to try, with these being your biggest unknowns. But that's all I have. Hopefully this helped, and enjoy Throne and Liberty.